There is a quiet kind of sadness that rarely announces itself. It doesn't cry out, it doesn't collapse or break. It simply lingers beneath the surface of people who think too deeply about every word they say, every expression they give, every moment that passes between themselves and another human being. It is the sadness of wondering if they are too much or not enough. The sadness of replaying conversations long after everyone else has moved on. The sadness of carrying the weight of interactions that others forget within seconds. And for those who live this way, it often feels invisible, because from the outside they seem thoughtful, polite, attentive. But inside there is a constant hum of self-interrogation, a soft ache that never quite settles. This is the emotional landscape of people who overthink every interaction. And beneath the surface, there is more happening than most ever realize. The beginning often appears subtle. A small moment after leaving a conversation when the mind begins replaying each detail. Did they sound annoyed? Was that joke unnecessary? Did the way the eyes shifted mean something? A tiny question becomes a spiral becomes a story, and the story becomes a feeling that is hard to shake. Overthinkers rarely notice when it starts. They simply wake up one day and realize they are carrying a constant fear of being misunderstood, a fear that their presence is somehow inconvenient, strange, or slightly wrong. This fear does not appear dramatically. It grows slowly, like fog filling a room. Barely noticeable until everything feels blurry. This emotional habit rarely comes from nowhere. Somewhere in their history, there was a lesson. Sometimes it came from a childhood home where small mistakes carried big consequences, where silence felt safer than being wrong, where reading the room was a skill learned for survival. Sometimes the lesson came from friendships where loyalty felt uncertain, where affection fluctuated without explanation, where confusion was normalized and clarity was scarce. And sometimes the root is simply sensitivity itself, an innate attunement to the emotional world, a mind that absorbs every subtle shift, every micro-expression, every pause between sentences. For many, overthinking is not a flaw. It is an adaptation, a way of staying safe in environments where unpredictability felt dangerous. The brain has a habit of filling in gaps when it feels uncertain. Neuroscience calls this predictive processing, the mind attempting to anticipate outcomes before they arrive. When someone grows accustomed to emotional unpredictability, the brain becomes hypervigilant. It scans, it analyzes, it decodes, not out of curiosity, but protection. Overthinkers often possess an amplified sensitivity to social cues. Their minds simulate possibilities, constructing dozens of interpretations for a single moment. The slight pause in someone's voice, the subtle change in tone, the shift of shoulders or eyes. To most, these cues feel random. To them, they feel like signals that must be understood, or else something important might be missed. Yet the brain's attempts to protect can also distort. In ambiguous situations, anxious minds tend to assume negative intent, not because they believe others are cruel, but because negativity feels more predictable than kindness. This creates a quiet war inside, a desire to connect battling against the fear of being misinterpreted, a longing for closeness battling against the belief that closeness is fragile. They want conversations to feel natural, but nothing feels natural when the mind is busy evaluating every moment. A simple message left unread becomes 1,000 possible reasons. One neutral expression becomes a sign of disappointment. A moment of silence becomes evidence that the relationship is shifting. Overthinkers do not want to feel this way. They simply cannot stop noticing, cannot stop predicting, cannot stop caring about every detail. And beneath that overactive attention lies a quieter truth. a truth that often goes unspoken. They don't overthink because they doubt others. They overthink because they doubt themselves, their value, their likability, their place in other people's lives. They fear being the one who misunderstands, the one who says too much, the one who says too little, the one who becomes a burden without realizing it. This inner conflict leaves them emotionally exhausted, not because interactions are hard, but because the aftermath is. The realization often comes slowly, not through a dramatic moment, but through a gentle recognition that the fear is costing more than it protects. At some point, they notice patterns. The things they fear rarely happen. The catastrophes they predict almost never unfold. The people they worry about losing often stay. They begin to see that the mind is trying to be helpful, but is replaying old stories in new environments. They begin to understand that the instinct to analyze was once necessary, but is no longer serving the person they are now. This is not a sudden shift. It is the beginning of awareness, and awareness softens the grip of old habits. They start noticing that not every silence carries meaning. Not every tone requires interpretation. Not every facial expression holds a message. Sometimes moments are simply moments. Not puzzles, not warnings, not signs. Just human moments, imperfect and ordinary. Healing for the overthinker is rarely dramatic. It is quiet, subtle, a gradual return to self-trust. It begins when they learn to sit with the discomfort of uncertainty without rushing to solve it. When they start giving others the benefit of the doubt without assuming the worst. When they allow space for ambiguity without interpreting it as danger. Healing emerges when they realize that not every interaction must be perfect to be meaningful, and not every misunderstanding is a threat. Sometimes it is simply a part of human connection. They start to see themselves not as someone who must earn belonging, but someone who already belongs. Someone who is allowed to take up space, allowed to speak imperfectly, allowed to exist without constant self-correction. The sadness begins to lift, not because the overthinking disappears, but because they learn to hold it with gentleness instead of fear. With time, they come to understand something deeper. Overthinking is not only a burden, it is also a sign of how deeply they care, how attentive they are, how profoundly they feel. Their sensitivity, once a source of quiet pain, becomes something they no longer resent. They learn to notice without fearing, to feel without collapsing, to think deeply without drowning in every possibility. They integrate the parts of themselves they once tried to fix, the cautiousness, the sensitivity, the emotional precision. They recognize the humanity woven into these traits. In the end, the hidden sadness of those who overthink every interaction comes from wanting so badly to be understood, yet believing they must earn that understanding with perfection. But connection was never meant to be perfect. It was meant to be human, and humanity is messy, ambiguous, beautiful in ways that cannot be analyzed or predicted. The mind may continue to wander, to question, to replay, but the heart learns a quieter truth. Most people are not examining your every word. Most moments are not fragile. Most interactions are simply the meeting of imperfect humans, doing their best to understand one another. And in that realization, the overthinker begins to breathe again. Not because the world changed, but because they finally allowed themselves to belong in it, without over-explaining their place.